France, August 1943. On a small Luftwaffe airfield, hidden among the woods of Normandy, the morning mist clung to the silver skins of worn-out W-190s. The air smelled of aviation fuel and damp earth. Then came the kind of news that could wake an entire base. An American P-47 Thunderbolt has been forced down. The pilot captured. The aircraft mostly intact. For the Luftwaffe, this was intelligence gold. A rare chance to see, touch, and dissect the giant machine that had been haunting their skies for months. German pilots had spoken of it with frustration and disbelief. A massive American brute that refused to die even after taking direct cannon hits. Now, at last, they could examine one up close. Oberleutnant Vera Schultz, Chief Technical Officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, arrived just after 400 hours. He was not a combat pilot, but an engineer, one of those quiet men who believed that the real war was fought not in the sky, but in the blueprints. As he stepped out onto the damp runway, he saw the Thunderbolt for the first time. It loomed over the ground, like a stranded whale of aluminum and rivets, its radial nose dominating its profile. Around him, pilots laughed. Das fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle, one of them jeered. It's too fat to fly, another joined in. Maybe it rolled here. Their laughter echoed across the hangars. The P-47 did look absurd compared to their sleek Messerschmitts. Fully loaded, it weighed almost 8 tons, twice as much as the FW-190, Germany's frontline fighter. But Schultz didn't laugh. He walked slowly around the machine eyes, tracing each rivet, each plate. There was something unsettling about its shape, a kind of functional ugliness, the kind that suggested purpose over beauty. He placed his gloved hand on the metal skin, feeling its thickness, the faint warmth still radiating from the flight it had survived. Too heavy to fly, he murmured to himself. And yet, it came down alive. Outside, the dull roar of engines starting up rolled through the morning fog, another German patrol preparing to climb into a sky increasingly ruled by the Allies. Schultz's mind drifted briefly to the nightly bombings over the Ruhr, the broken factories, the shortages of steel and rubber. Every day, Germany was fighting not just the Allies, but arithmetic itself. Now, standing before this captured American fighter, he sensed something larger than a mere machine. It was a message forged in aluminum and oil, sent from an enemy whose factories were humming with endless energy. He ordered the mechanics to tow the aircraft into the hangar for a full teardown. Inside, under the pale yellow light of inspection lamps, the silver paint of the P-47 gleamed faintly, its white star insignia stark against the gray of occupied France. As the metal cooled and clicked, Schultz pulled out his notebook. Equations began to form in his mind. Power-to-weight ratios, air density, at altitude compression limits. This was not curiosity born of admiration. It was the instinct of a man who knew numbers never lied. That morning, Oberleutnant Vera Schultz could not yet know that what he was about to uncover would shake his faith in Germany's war entirely. Beneath the oil-streaked skin of this grotesque American fighter lay a quiet, devastating revelation: Germany had already lost a war. It didn't yet realize it was fighting not a war of pilots or dogfights, but a war of factories, production lines, and raw industrial power. If you're still watching right now, thank you for staying with the story. I'd love to know who you are and where you're watching from. Tell me your name, your city. Maybe what part of history fascinates you the most. These stories feel more alive when we share them together. So drop a comment below. I read them all, and your thoughts might inspire the next episode we bring to life. When the hangar doors groaned shut, the chill of the morning gave way to the metallic warmth of lamps and welding torches. Schultz's team gathered around the captured aircraft like surgeons about to open a patient. With deliberate care, they loosened the bolts, removed the cowling, and revealed the beating heart of the Thunderbolt, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. Even to a seasoned engineer, it was a sight to behold. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 perfect rows of 9, a twin-row radial engine that seemed less like machinery and more like a statement of industrial faith. The Germans stood silently for a moment. The size was intimidating, yes, but what truly stunned Schultz was the precision. Every seam aligned, every component fitted like a watchmaker's dream. He leaned closer, fingers tracing the smooth contour of a cylinder head. The tolerances were impossibly tight, perhaps within thousandths of a millimeter. The crankshaft glistened, a masterpiece of metallurgy. Schultz scribbled figures into his notebook, his mind already calculating displacement and compression ratios. At least 2,000 horsepower, he muttered. Maybe more with that turbo system built in. He thought of the BMW 801, the pride of German aviation, powering the FW-190. It could barely reach 1,700 horsepower on its best day, and that was with factory workers pushing tools and materials to the limit. The Americans, meanwhile, were mass-producing engines that outclassed theirs by 30%, and doing it as if it were nothing. One of the younger mechanics called out, astonished. "Herr Oberleutnant, look here, each cylinder is removable on its own. If one fails, they can replace it without tearing the whole engine apart." Schultz stepped closer. The mechanic was right. Modular design, a concept simple in theory, revolutionary in execution. Ingenious, Schultz said softly. This wasn't built for glory. It was built for war, for long campaigns, for machines that must fly again and again. He knew the difference instantly. German designs prized efficiency and elegance, squeezing performance from scarcity. But here before him was a design built around abundance. Abundance of materials, of skilled labor, of foresight. The Americans weren't building aircraft to be perfect. They were building them to be repaired quickly and returned to battle. He could almost imagine the contrast in a vast hangar somewhere in New Jersey. Assembly lines roared day and night. Engines rolled off conveyors, identical down to the last bolt. Tools, standardized workers trained in repetition, not artistry. Meanwhile, in Germany, factories were darkening under Allied bombs. Skilled machinists were gone, replaced by hurried laborers or prisoners of war. For a moment, Schultz stood still, the hum of the lamps above him, blending with the ringing in his ears. He understood perhaps better than anyone in that room what this engine meant. It wasn't just a piece of technology. It was a glimpse into the soul of an industrial civilization that could outbuild, outrepair, and ultimately outlast his own. He closed his notebook slowly. The numbers didn't lie. This R-2800 wasn't merely an engine. It was a factory's promise cast in steel and aluminum, a promise Germany could no longer make. When Schultz moved toward the rear of the P-47's fuselage, he noticed something strange, a tangle of pipes and ducts running along the belly of the aircraft like veins beneath the skin. They weren't standard exhaust channels. Their complexity defied the neat simplicity of German design. He followed the network, carefully tracing the polished conduits that disappeared toward the tail. There, housed deep within the fuselage, was the secret. A turbine, small yet formidable, connected by heat-resistant ducting that shimmered under the work lights. It took Schultz a few seconds to understand what he was seeing. Then his breath caught. "A turbo-supercharger," he whispered. The Americans had actually done it. He had read intelligence reports about such systems before theoretical papers half-tested prototypes, mostly failures. The idea was elegant use. The engine's own exhaust gases to spin a turbine at astonishing speeds, over 20,000 revolutions per minute, and feed compressed air back into the engine. The result, full power, even in the thin atmosphere, above 25,000 feet. It was genius and insanity. The temperatures alone should have torn the turbine apart. The bearings should have melted. The ducting should have warped or cracked. Yet here it was intact, beautifully built, its surfaces smooth, and its welds flawless. Schultz crouched to examine the turbine blades, nickel-chromium alloy, heat-treated, balanced to perfection. Germany had tried to build such systems, but the materials required high-grade steel precision bearings. Rare alloys were beyond what its struggling factories could now produce. He straightened up slowly, the weight of realization settling over him. This is more than technology," he said quietly to his team. "It's infrastructure. His assistant frowned. "You mean their factories? I mean their civilization," Schultz replied. "They can build this because they have the steel, the mines, the tools, the electricity, and the luxury of time." He thought of the contrast again. In Germany, turbo-supercharger projects had been shelved one after another. Engineers lacked the alloys to withstand the heat. Machinists lacked the precision tools. Even when designs worked on paper, reality refused to cooperate. And yet the Americans had put this miracle into mass production, not in prototypes, not in experimental aircraft, but in hundreds, soon thousands of Thunderbolts rolling off the line. Schultz's pencil scratched across his notebook. The math was brutal at high altitudes, where the FW-190 and BF-109 gasped for air. The P-47 would be hitting its stride, faster, stronger, uncatchable. Up there, above 25,000 feet, the Luftwaffe's fighters became sluggish, their mechanical superchargers gasping for oxygen. But this machine, this flying milk bottle, would breathe freely, roaring like a locomotive in the thin sky. One of his mechanics, still clinging to hope, asked the question they were all thinking. "Could we replicate it?" Herr Oberleutnant Schultz stared at the maze of polished metal and shook his head slowly. "Not with what we have. Not with what's left." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "To build this, we'd need new factories, new machines, new metals, a new world." Silence filled the hangar. The air smelled faintly of oil and hot metal. But beneath that, Schultz sensed something heavier, the scent of inevitability. He knew what he was looking at wasn't just a technological advantage. It was a mathematical proof of defeat. A symbol of an enemy whose industrial heart beat stronger, faster, and longer than Germany's ever could. The Thunderbolt's secret was no longer a mystery. It was prophecy, a turbine, spinning not just air, but the machinery of a war Germany could never hope to win. By the afternoon, the hangar echoed with the clatter of tools and the smell of heated oil. Schultz had seen enough engines in his life to know their limits, but now he wanted to understand the body that carried such a monster. The P-47 sat before him like a wounded giant, its silver hide pocked with scars from the sky. As his team examined the fuselage, the story of its last battle revealed itself in holes and tears. Cannon shells had punched through the wings. Machine gun fire had ripped along the spine. Yet somehow, impossibly, this aircraft had landed intact. One of the mechanics ran a finger along a ragged gash near the tail. 20-millimeter hit, he muttered, shaking his head. "On one of ours, this would have been fatal." Schultz said nothing. He measured the aluminum skin, thick, reinforced, far heavier than anything on a BF-109. Beneath it, he found a dense lattice of ribs and spars, all overbuilt and redundant. Every control line had a backup. The cockpit, he noticed, was encased like a fortress, armored steel plates around the seat, bullet-resistant glass on the windscreen, thick enough to stop a cannon fragment. And then, there was the engine, the great radial beast at the front. Unlike the delicate liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz engines of Germany's fighters, this one needed no fragile coolant system, no radiators, no piping to rupture. You could blow away a few cylinders, and it would still run. Schultz had read reports claiming that P-47s often returned home with half their engines destroyed, and now he believed them. "Over-engineered," one of his men muttered almost accusingly. "They've wasted power and weight." Schultz turned to him, eyes distant. "Yes, but they can afford to waste it. They have power to spare. We don't." That single sentence hung in the air like a confession. Germany, he realized, had built its machines like dueling swords, light, elegant, deadly, but fragile. America had built hammers, crude in shape perhaps, but indestructible, unstoppable. One philosophy sought perfection, the other sought permanence. And in war, permanence was winning. He jotted another note: P-47 designed to survive, not to impress. The mechanics continued their work, prying open panels and marking bullet paths. Schultz watched, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Luftwaffe pilots, brave, skilled men who had emptied their cannons into these flying fortresses, only to watch them lumber away, trailing smoke, but refusing to die. He could almost hear their disbelief over the radio. "It's still flying. How is it still flying?" Looking again at the thick armor, the redundant systems, the massive frame, Schultz understood. The Americans had designed a fighter that expected to be shot at damaged and still come home. They had built not a duelist's rapier, but a boxer one that could take punches all day long and still throw a knockout blow. He ran a hand along the bullet-scarred metal, feeling its cold resolve. This machine wasn't elegant. It wasn't beautiful. But it was alive, and that in war was all that mattered. The P-47 was proof of an uncomfortable truth. The era of artistry in aviation was ending. The era of industrial survival had begun. When the inspection reached the wings, Schultz expected to find something ordinary. Perhaps 2 cannons. Maybe a pair of machine guns like those on the FW-190. What he found instead made him pause. The American fighter's wings were lined with 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 on each side, perfectly spaced each, with its own ammunition belt and feed mechanism. He followed the belts and blinked. Each gun carried nearly 400 rounds. That was over 3,000 rounds of heavy ammunition in total. He did the math quickly, instinctively. At their combined rate of fire, more than 100 rounds every second poured from this machine when it attacked. It wasn't a fighter. It was a storm. In his mind, he compared it to the Luftwaffe's own weapons. The Bf-109 2 machine guns, 1 cannon. The FW-190, a pair of cannons, maybe 4 if lucky, and a few hundred rounds at most. Pilots had to conserve ammunition, choose shots, carefully fire for just a heartbeat or 2. But a Thunderbolt pilot could hold the trigger for 10 seconds and unleash more firepower than a German squadron. Schultz's pencil stopped mid-note. A wall of lead, he whispered, remembering reports from Luftwaffe units pilots, claiming that attacking a P-47 head-on was suicide. Now, seeing it in person, he understood why. With 8 guns converging on a single point, anything caught in that cone would be torn apart, not just damaged. He picked up one of the massive 50 caliber rounds from the workbench. It was as long as his hand, heavier than it looked, built for penetration rather than finesse. The bullet could punch through armor, fuel tanks, even engine blocks. Multiply that by 8 streams of fire, and you had something more terrifying than precision. You had inevitability. One of his men muttered, "It's excessive. Who needs that many guns?" Schultz turned the bullet in his fingers. "Someone who plans to win by not missing," he said. He imagined the American doctrine fighters not as duelists, but as flying artillery, built to sweep the sky clean, to escort bombers, to protect fleets of aircraft on their long journeys across Europe. It was quantity applied to every element: ammunition, horsepower, armor, endurance. They weren't building aces. They were building systems. And systems, Schultz realized, win wars. He made another note in his book, his handwriting tense but steady. Recommendation: avoid head-on engagements. Probability of survival: minimal. As the hours dragged on, Schultz sat alone at the back of the hangar, staring at the open Thunderbolt. He could still hear the clang of tools and the murmur of his mechanics, but his mind was far away, picturing squadrons of these machines streaking across the channel, hundreds of 8-gun monsters filling the air with thunder. The thought chilled him more than the morning cold ever could, because in that moment he finally understood what the Americans had built. Not just a fighter, but a philosophy in metal. One that didn't trust in the reflexes of the few, but in the unrelenting power of the many. He closed his notebook once more. This was not a duel Germany could win. The P-47 didn't need elegance or subtlety or even precision. It only needed a direction and a trigger. And when that trigger was pulled, the sky itself turned to fire. By the time Schultz finished his examination, the sun was low, a dull orange bleeding through the hangar windows, casting long shadows across the silver wreck. He stood at his desk, surrounded by pages of calculations, sketches, and fragments of insight. What emerged from those numbers was not just a technical assessment, but a portrait of a nation outmatched. Every system of the P-47, the engine, the turbo-supercharger, the armor, the armament pointed to a single truth: industrial supremacy. The Americans weren't winning because of a single innovation, but because they could integrate all of them at once in numbers that defied logic. He cross-checked production data sent from Berlin's intelligence office. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Republic Aviation was producing over 500 Thunderbolts a month, with plans to reach 800. In contrast, all of Germany's factories combined were struggling to produce 300 to 400 fighters total, and that was before Allied bombers reduced yet another plant to rubble. He rubbed his temples and kept reading. The same R-2800 engine powering the P-47 was also used in bombers, night fighters, and naval aircraft. By war's end, American industry would produce more than 125,000 of these engines, half as many as Germany's entire wartime engine output across all types and models. Schultz recalculated the ratios again and again, hoping he had made a mistake. But the numbers did not change. 85,000 American aircraft in 1943. He whispered, eyes fixed on the page. 25,000 for us. And they're heavier, more complex, and better built. The realization was crushing. America wasn't just outproducing Germany, it was redefining what production meant. For every 3 German aircraft that reached the front, 9 American ones were already in the sky. And beyond those planes stood an invisible army of workers, engineers, and machines, all protected by oceans and untouched cities. He began to write his report, his pen steady, but his thoughts heavy. Each paragraph was a confession of defeat, dressed as analysis. The P-47 Thunderbolt demonstrates a level of industrial and technological sophistication beyond our current capacity. Its mass production indicates that the United States' manufacturing potential exceeds all previous intelligence estimates. Continued attrition against such forces will lead to unsustainable losses. He paused, staring at those words. They were factual, mathematical, but to any Nazi official, they would sound treasonous. Still, Schultz refused to soften them. An engineer's duty was to truth, not ideology. When he presented the report to his commanding officer, the man read it silently, then looked up with weary eyes. "You know Berlin will not like this," he said quietly. "They don't want to hear that American machines are superior." "Should I change it?" Schultz asked, though he already knew the answer. The officer shook his head. "No, the report is accurate. But be ready. Truth is dangerous these days." A week later, word came back. The report had been filed, stamped, and quietly dismissed as overly pessimistic. One staff officer allegedly wrote in the margin, "Engineer, demoralized by enemy propaganda." The P-47 is crude American over-engineering. Schultz wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. Reports ignored warnings, buried numbers replaced by slogans. To the regime, reality was an inconvenience. That night, as the sirens wailed in the distance and bomb flashes lit the horizon, Schultz sat alone under the yellow light of his desk lamp. In front of him lay the carbon copy of his report. He stared at it for a long time, before locking it away in a metal cabinet. Outside, the airfield lights flickered briefly, revealing the shattered outlines of hangars and fuel drums. The truth, Schultz realized, was just like those lights, bright for an instant, then swallowed by darkness. But numbers would wait. They did not fade, and they did not forgive. 2 years later, the war was over. The Reich lay in ruins, cities leveled, factories silent, the sky no longer theirs. In a cold interrogation room somewhere in occupied Germany, Oberleutnant Vera Schultz sat across from an American technical officer. On the table between them lay a folder, his 1943 report on the captured P-47. The officer flipped through the pages, his expression half curious, half impressed. "You really concluded from one aircraft that Germany would lose the war?" Schultz hesitated. Then he nodded. "Not the war of soldiers," he said softly. "The war of factories. The P-47 was proof of what we couldn't match: precision, material, scale. It was arithmetic. The Americans smiled faintly. "You weren't wrong. We found your report in Berlin. It was marked, filed, no action required." Schultz gave a dry laugh. Of course it was. In the Third Reich, truth was the one thing no one wanted to act on. He spoke quietly, but his words carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen logic buried beneath ideology. "Many of us knew," he continued. Canaris, Speer, Galland, they all saw the same signs. But in Germany, saying we are losing was not analysis. It was treason. The officer closed the folder gently. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then, Schultz added almost to himself, "I believed in mathematics. The Americans believed in industry, and mathematics proved them right." Years later, when war production figures were finally declassified, Schultz's calculations were vindicated. If anything, they had been conservative. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States had built over 300,000 aircraft. Germany, just 94,000. The Americans had produced more than 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts alone, more than Germany's total number of Bf-109s and FW-190s combined during the same period. Factories that had once built cars now churned out aircraft engines. Shipyards built carriers instead of freighters. Ford, General Motors, and Chevrolet produced the same R-2800 engines that had once stunned Schultz, over 125,000 of them. And astonishingly, quality had not fallen. Even in 1945, American aircraft rolled off the lines, as flawless as those built in 1943. Meanwhile, Germany's fighters grew cheaper, rougher, less reliable. Aluminum gave way to steel, precision to improvisation. The Luftwaffe's last aircraft carried the scars not just of battle, but of desperation. In his old age, Schultz would say little about the war. But when asked what moment made him realize it was lost, he never spoke of battles or generals. He spoke of a single day, in a hangar in occupied France, of an American fighter that looked grotesque, of the smell of hot metal and oil, and of the turbine spinning quietly at its tail. That machine, he once said, wasn't ugly. It was inevitable. The story of Vera Schultz and the captured P-47 is more than a footnote in aviation history. It is a reflection of a larger truth that wars are not won only by courage or tactics or even genius. They are won by systems, by factories that never sleep, by workers who outnumber bullets, by the cold precision of industry and the relentless march of production. The P-47 Thunderbolt went on to become one of the most produced and most effective fighters of the Second World War. It escorted bombers over Europe, shredded Luftwaffe squadrons, and helped secure air dominance that made D-Day possible. But for one German engineer, it was something even greater, a prophecy carved in metal. Because long before Berlin fell, before the swastikas came down, before the guns fell silent, the outcome had already been written. Not in speeches or battle plans, but in the equations of horsepower, in the thickness of aluminum, and in the roar of factories an ocean away. When I think about Schultz's story, I'm struck by how quietly devastating it is. He didn't lose a dogfight. He lost to a factory, to a system that could build faster than his nation could dream. It reminds me that behind every victory in history lies more than bravery. It's planning, production, and the belief that truth matters more than pride. If you found this story as haunting and fascinating as I did, take a moment to subscribe. There are many more forgotten chapters like this one, stories that reveal not just how wars were fought, but how they were decided long before the first shot was fired.